Hey everyone, welcome to episode 2 of Games as a Product podcast. In this podcast, we talk about games and the gaming industry from the perspective of two product managers. Myself, I've worked in the game industry, and my friend Kyle, he has experience in hardware and software as well.
I haven't worked necessarily in the game industry, but I'm very in tune with it. It's a big hobby of mine, and I'm very passionate about it. So I wanted to talk a little bit about AAA games and the current state, right? So there's been a number of headlines coming out this week that have shed the light on what's going on from a business and economic standpoint with AAA games. So let's talk a little bit about that today. So I wanted to start by getting your thoughts on the leaked email from Phil Spencer. So back in 2020, he had written an email to his supervisors or bosses at Microsoft talking about the state of AAA gaming. And he raised a few interesting points, number of which relate to the increasing expense of making AAA games and how that's kind of getting publishers to rely on established IP as opposed to taking a risk, right? And on top of that, these big publishers that have existed in the industry for years and years haven't adapted very well to the state of digital distribution. Even though the email was written in 2020, it definitely still is super applicable today.
Yeah, so speaking of increased costs for AAA games, what's interesting about the email is that the increased budgets is actually a competitive advantage for AAA studios. Essentially, what Phil is saying is that AAA can no longer compete on the distribution front. So the way they can outcompete just the general game market is by having the biggest and best production and the highest quality in the games. Games that cost over $100 million to produce and then $100 million more to market, that's where AAA studios have the advantage over the rest of the competition. So that's a very interesting take. And I think a lot of this is due to the onset of so many distribution platforms for games, including Steam, including Epic. And my guess is that these new distribution platforms are either more attractive or more accessible to smaller developers. So these smaller studios don't have to go through the traditional AAA publisher to get their games out.
Right. And one of the interesting things that happened several years ago is that AAA publishers like EA and Ubisoft, who were supporting Steam, games on Steam, launching their games on Steam, decided that they wanted to have their own platforms, right? And the assumption was that it was so that they didn't have to pay 30% fee to Valve for their service, and they were able to get customer data and have more direct access to the customer. But you've seen over the past year or two that those kinds of publishers have actually started to make their way back to Steam. What does that tell you about the state of publishers?
Yeah, it means that publishers are going to where the users are, where the players are. Players are flocking to Steam first and foremost over their publisher's primary platform. Like, for example, who goes to EA, what's it called? EA Access, is that the platform? And also Ubisoft have their own marketplace. Nobody goes to those first-party marketplaces first. Instead, they go to these aggregation platforms like Steam. That's where all the users are. And eventually, as a business, you have to go where your users are.
Yeah, I think one of the things that they're running into is, okay, well, it's a giant visibility issue in that, hey, sometimes there's games that come out. Now, I'm going to include Epic. They do claim to have lots of active users, but, I don't necessarily know that there's a large proportion of the users that they have who are logging in and playing all the time. Anecdotally, from things that I've seen around the internet, is that a lot of people who use Epic Game Store basically log in, claim the free game, and don't touch it again until next week, right? They might be counted as an active user because they logged in. They're not actually engaging with it. They're not buying things. They've recently walked back some of their exclusive money that they were giving to larger publishers. Personal level, I've forgotten that Kingdom Hearts exists on PC. Those 3 games are Epic Game Store exclusives, they've been out for 2 to 3 years. It's not something you hear people talking a whole lot about. One of the things that you run into, especially with PC, is that even these gigantic publishers who don't have their own distribution platforms are having real visibility issues using anything outside of Steam.
And that goes into one of the articles that you actually shared with me earlier about Sony prioritizing AAA games over taking bets on new IP, smaller games. If there is a visibility issue, the logical thought is to go for brand recognizability or games that are easily marketable. And as a result, it seems to me the obvious direction is to flock to these established AAA titles and IPs because there's so much noise out there that if you just put a household name out there, players will see it and recognize it rather than trying to market and promote something that nobody's ever heard of.
I definitely agree with you. And this is actually a point that Phil Spencer made. He used the example of Star Wars. EA was creatively hedging their bets. Let's be honest here, it's a Souls-like, a Souls-like Metroidvania, right? So you're not breaking any new ground with necessarily the mechanics. I mean, they're put together in a fun way, but you're also using an extraordinarily popular IP with global appeal. Made more business sense for them to leverage this license that they had. Granted, that could be because, going back to when they signed the deal to be the exclusive publisher of Star Wars games, that could be part of it because it was available to them and they have that relationship. One of the things that really stands out to me with Sony is they've gone from somebody who used to publish experimental games. I'm talking about your Tokyo Jungles and Ape Escapes and stuff like that. That was obviously very off the wall. And, their Japan studio was known for that. And over this past 4, 5, 6 years, they've closed down Japan studio and focusing on IPs that people know, whether it be Spider-Man or God of War, which
they're closing down these indie developers probably because they don't make much money, right? They don't make much business sense. Then I ask myself, why are they not profitable? Is it an issue with product market fit where the PlayStation platform is not attracting the right users who play these indie games? Or is it an issue of discoverability and promotion? A lot of people like to talk about Netflix, and I'm going to talk about Netflix again. It can aggregate all of these really niche and indie movie genres, and then the competitive advantage is that its recommendation algorithm is able to surface these random small movies to you that you enjoy watching. What I'm thinking about is PlayStation just not good enough with recommendations, or do the customers just not go on PlayStation and they go on, let's just say, Unreal, Epic Store, or Steam instead? What do you think?
I think when you have these really inflating budgets for AAA games, you have to search for where am I able to make the most money and reach the largest audience. And I think that's, especially in PlayStation's case, they've gone from spending money on more niche products to, okay, let's try to, what's the Madden of non-sports games? They've made that conscious shift because they were already successful in that area, saw that they were able to reach a larger audience with those games. But going back to the Netflix thing that you mentioned, it's funny that you bring that up because I think that is one of the things that Microsoft is going for with the Game Pass. Microsoft purchased studios like Obsidian, and one of the things that kind of stood out was the Game Pass model, like the Netflix model, allows them to say, okay, well, hey, we can make smaller projects and we don't have to appeal to everybody with these projects, right? Instead, the subscription fee from all these people aggregated supports some of these more niche titles. And the interesting thing about these things too, talking about AAA games, is that they've been getting longer and longer. Not only the matter of these things becoming more expensive, but also just becoming kind of time sinks. And it's refreshing in a way to see those mid-tier projects that Sony is no longer working on the Xbox side now, which used to be the total opposite.
AAA still has a huge advantage in marketing. And you were talking about trying to find the Madden of non-sports games. When you create these huge AAA titles, it's way easier to market through traditional marketing channels, right? Just think big billboards, massive ads, in-person activations. You can do that way easier with these AAA IP titles. So that's still a huge advantage for the AAA publishers. Speaking of the point you made about games being longer, right? I think that's a really interesting transition to talking about just live service games in general, where the model of releasing games is not just releasing games separately one by one and then hoping that each of them is going to be a success. The new business model is releasing a successful game, and then if it's successful, extend that for as long as possible because it's easier and better for business to extend the longevity of a successful game and get revenue from its users than trying to find the next hit, right? Trying to find hits from different games is hard. So once you found a hit, the business and the publisher wants to maximize what they can get out of it.
Yeah, and this is something that, again, talking about Sony, they announced, I believe it was last year, that they were going to release 10 live service games by 2026. Just this week, Jim Ryan, who is the president of PlayStation, announced that he was retiring and he was going to leave. Jason Schreier, who's a well-respected journalist in the field, was questioning, where do they go from here? Do they keep with that live service focus? It's not necessarily as trendy as in the industry as it was a few years ago, where you saw everybody trying to do live service. But there's been a number of high profile failures. And the one that stands out to me, right this second, is today was the last day to purchase the Avengers. That was a big Square Enix project from their Western studios when they owned Crystal Dynamics. And that was something they probably thought, hey, this IP is huge. It's too big to fail. But the gameplay wasn't necessarily appealing. It's a number of high profile failures, right? Where does that leave games as a service? Should there be any strategic changes in the direction for publishers like Sony?
If you're approaching a game and hoping that it succeeds as a live service game, you're taking a big bet, because live service games are only successful if you're able to capture an audience. So if you're going to put all this upfront investment in live services and it flops, you are basically wasting a huge amount of budget supporting all this live service content. My approach would be to launch great base games, and if the base games are good and it does capture audience, then you can add live services on top of that. But trying to create hit live services games from the start, you're putting all your eggs in one basket. You're thinking too far when you should be thinking about just making your base game a success.
I think that makes a lot of sense, but in the same way, you run into the problem if you start taking games that were not necessarily designed from the get-go to be live service, and then you release it, find out it's a big success, and then you start tacking on live service elements. I mean, a lot of what you see in live service games involves numbers of currencies and gear treadmills and things like that, and you risk alienating your audience a little bit. What do you think about that?
I think it's not too difficult to make games compatible with live services. The modern trend of game design is to be flexible with different game currencies and be able to adapt to new content pretty easily. Basically, live services is a lot of incremental small expansions. So instead of one big expansion once per year, you have just these smaller incremental expansions once per month or once per quarter. I think as long as the game design is flexible, you can extend the life of a game through continuous content distribution through live services.
One more thing on the PlayStation front to discuss before we move on is that in this report that Jason Schreier put out, he had heard that there was a lot of issues with Sony studios who have historically been making these single-player, third-person adventures that we were talking about, and then that now they're being tasked with making live service games. And one of the examples that I had heard of is Naughty Dog working on The Last of Us Factions, I believe it's called, which is supposed to be a live service game. They've done multiplayer before. They've done it in Uncharted. I don't think they've ever done a full-on game as a service, continuous update cadence like that, right? So the concern that I have, Feng, if you're going to say, okay, well, you can convert these, is that it might be a very different studio setup. I think let's shift gears a little bit and talk about Square Enix, because we alluded a little bit to some of the things that they were doing. There was an issue kind of allowing Square Enix's producers, and we're talking, this is the Japanese arm. They've sold off the Western arm to the Embracer Group as of last year. But talking about how their producers are given too much control over the product. One of the things that stood out to me is that this was the AAA studio that we had been talking about. They've been trying all kinds of different products, right? Forspoken, Diofield Chronicle, really making, this conscious effort to diversify their IP, right? And some of them have been successful and some of them have not, but they kind of mixed in with huge AAA budget games like Final Fantasy 16, right? So what are your thoughts on kind of these producers and these AAA publishers trying to diversify, but hammered from a stock standpoint, investors not necessarily being happy with that?
Yeah, this is a really tough dilemma for game studios. I think it's right to try to explore creation of new IPs, creation of new franchises, because ultimately that's how you can grow your studio. The recent failures of Square Enix highlights why current publishers are so conservative in terms of game development, why they're creating more Call of Duty games, why they're creating more Star Wars games, because they have a higher probability of success. You really can't blame Square Enix for trying, right? You have to try. If you're not going to try to create new titles, new IPs, then you're just going to lose out to the people who have bought the license for established IPs. Kudos to Square Enix for trying, and I hope they can find something.
I think it makes sense from a creative standpoint. Can't rely on the same IPs again and again, right? Eventually the well is going to go dry. And stepping outside of gaming for just a second, I think that's a problem that Disney's running into with Marvel and Star Wars right now. And I almost think that's because they've, played the same notes over and over again. They follow a similar script. But thinking again about Square Enix, one of the things that they may have done in the past to help mitigate some of those risks releasing these different games is sort of taking exclusivity payments. I'm not necessarily certain that that's working out for them. You, as the game developer and publisher, you care more about the success of a product than the platform that you're dealing with, right? It's like, okay, well, that platform has a very nice thing to say, hey, look, you want to buy this game, you want to buy Final Fantasy, you have to use our platform for at least, a certain period. But at the end of the day, they have their own worries and other things to promote, where you're kind of hinging some of your biggest IP on these partnerships. What's your thought on that?
The issue with exclusivity is that it's great to get new IPs and new platforms started and ramped up. The downsides of being exclusive for so long is that Square Enix has such brand recognition within the PlayStation ecosystem. As they are trying to expand beyond the PlayStation ecosystem, they're finding that users and players are not organically attracted to their offerings. So I think this is a growing pains by expanding outside of the original exclusive ecosystem.
Microsoft, for its part, they just announced a few months ago that where possible, Final Fantasy games will be coming to Xbox, right? And I know they don't necessarily do the most business on there, but I think that speaks to your point that says, hey, they need to move beyond having their main support be one console platform. If you are able to launch your game on Microsoft, you might get promotion from them, right? And this goes back to talking about some of the things you were saying earlier about billboards in Times Square, where Microsoft might be invested in promoting it. And hey, if somebody sees it and they only have a PlayStation, they might go buy the game on PlayStation. So you're getting benefits as a publisher by launching on all platforms. So it's really interesting, right? The state of AAA gaming changed quite a bit, right? I would argue that the most creatively fertile time was the PS2 era, but now it's becoming more homogenized, and I think the business is harder. They have to spend to take risks, but they might get punished for it by investors if those things aren't successful. But at the same time, that you have to keep building new IP in order to maintain it, because there's marketplace fatigue. So this is a really interesting space, and I'm curious to see where it goes over the next few years. So Feng, do you have any final thoughts on this?
In the mobile gaming space, a lot of medium-sized studios flock to mobile because they have a chance to get discovered there through the App Store algorithms and also through mobile advertising. But there really isn't that kind of accessible marketing and advertising in the console world and in the PC world. So what I'm wondering is, if new ad tech gets developed and better algorithms are created by distribution platforms, I wonder if that could lead to a rise of medium-sized studios and even smaller studios in the PC and console space, rather than having to rely on AAA marketing budgets. Maybe I'm focusing a little bit too much on this, but I really think when you say AAA, it really comes down to marketing. A lot of game developers are very talented, and they can make very polished games that look very good, that look almost AAA quality. So the difference really comes down to, do you have a AAA marketing budget? Do you have $100 million, $200 million to spend on huge marketing for your games? That's where really AAA publishing still retains its huge competitive advantage.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing. And it's not, like you said, just about spending the money on building the game.
I think this kind of wraps up our discussion of talking about AAA games and AAA publishing. Thanks for chatting with me today.
You're welcome. I'm glad to do it at any time.
See you guys next time.